speaking on Marxism through Brazilian and American historical lenses. He also did this for my historiography class, so again, we're on the history of history. Just exactly what you were signing up for today, wasn't it, right? More history. His presentation is, again, Marxism through Brazilian and American lenses. Take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Henrico Correia, and I'm going to talk about my research on Marxism through Brazilian and American historical lenses. This research was done under the mentorship of Dr. Tepska for the historiography course, which is the course on history, theory and methodology on the history major. So, in this presentation, I will share some of my findings with you, and I hope that at the end you can have a better understanding of this topic. The ideas of Karl Marx have been controversial since their origins in 1848. Over time, the views and interpretations that historians have had of Marxism have evolved. The Cold War, in particular, had played an important role in how scholars have viewed this topic. This project focuses on how historians in Brazil and the United States had viewed Marx and his theories. In this paper, I looked at how Marxism was approached by Americans and Brazilians, especially in the academy. As a Brazilian living in the US, it was an interest of mine to understand how both countries talk about the subject. Initially, it was meant only to analyze works within the academy, but for the US part of the paper, it was better to analyze works outside of the academy as well. During my research, it was clear that people writing outside of the academy had stronger feelings about the topic. There were people who had negative and others that had positive takeaways, but the group of the negatives were bigger in both countries outside of the academy. Within the academy though, in the United States, they would be more cautious while talking about it, despite inclining a little bit more towards a positive view. In Brazil, there were more openly Marxist historians, defending Marxist views and normally involved in politics too. My expectations when I started the project were that members of the academy would have stronger opinions on Marx and his works, and that Americans would be more critical, while Brazilians would be more open to Marx. However, the research has shown me a different scenario. The major debates in the field were about the nature of the ideas. Are they positive or negative? Are they outdated? And not surprisingly, historians have different views about it. This debate has suffered major shifts due to the Russian Revolution and the rise of the USSR, as publications before, during, and after the first socialist experience in the world were quite different. The Cold War significantly impacted how scholars in both countries approach Marxism. As a result, I have organized my findings into three categories: pre-Cold War, between 1848 and 1945, during the Cold War, between 1945 and the 1990s, and post-Cold War, between 1990s and the present days. But after all, what is Marxism? Marxism is an ideology created by the German historian, economist, philosopher, and political theorist Karl Marx. Marx was born in 1818, and in 1848, alongside Friedrich Engels, a German philosopher, political theorist, and historian, he wrote the Communist Manifesto. In his work, Marx exposed his views on how society should be ruled, and for him, it was clear that industrial capitalism was not the answer. He defended that capitalism was based in the exploitation of the working class by the owners of the means of production. A system which, according to him, led society to enormous inequality among its citizens. He believed that class struggle was a primary motor of history, with class struggle being the fight between the ones that dominated and the ones that were dominated. In his views, class struggle would lead to a revolution of the working class. When the capitalist system had exploited them so much, they would realize that they had nothing to lose but their chains, and therefore take over the government and start building a society where everything would be held in common, a communist society. After Marx, many authors have written about Marxism in many different ways. In this work, I looked at some of them to compare the American and the Brazilian contexts. Before the Cold War, there were not many publications on Marxism in the United States. The two major debates on the field about whether the ideas were positive or negative, outdated or applicable, were viewed in opposing ways by the authors that I analyzed. The first one was Morris Hilquit, a Latvian that came to the United States before his 20s and was the founder of the Socialist Party of America. The other one was Clarence Burnside, an American businessman considered the founder of the frozen food industry. Hilquit had a positive view of the topic, as in Eastern Europe, Marx's ideas were generally viewed in a better way. In addition to it, in his arrival at the US, he faced problems that would be common to all immigrants. Did not have a life full of comfort, at least at the beginning. So, the ideas of Marx were very appealing to him. On the other hand, Clarence Burnside saw Marxism as a form of tyranny. As a businessman and industry owner, capitalism was very far away from being prejudicial to him. But a system that defended equality among people and the rise of the working class to take over the government and the means of production would not be his favorite system for obvious reasons. Burnside's views was closer to the views of the American public at that time. Moving to Brazil, I found very little engagement by scholars with the topic. Brazil was still a country in development, trying to figure out the problems that more than 300 years of slavery and colonization had caused. The public, influenced by the conservative elites, would fear the idea of communism. Marx's ideas demanded from the beginning a high level of intellectual comprehension, and most of the Brazilian people at the time would be illiterate. So the only ones that talked about it were the members of the Brazilian Communist Party, who was created in 1922. During the Cold War, American historians would be extra careful while talking about Marxism, or not talk about it at all, as the Cold War was the biggest battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, representing capitalism and socialism, respectively. The works I have analyzed dated to the last decade of the war, since in the decades before it could be dangerous to discuss the subject. During the first decades of the Cold War, the anti-communist propaganda was at its highest level with McCarthyism, and there was a real risk of losing your job or having to flee the country if you were suspected of sympathizing with Marx's ideas. The historians I looked at were Michael Denning, an American cultural historian and professor of American Studies at Yale University, Eric Foner, also an American historian and Pulitzer Prize winner, and Shalom-Bit Liss, American historian and distinguished professor of Latin American history at the University of Akron. All three were cautious in their writings, but they inclined more towards a positive view. In the Brazilian case, during this time, there were openly Marxist historians. After a period of dictatorships and the life conditions of the people with poor or no improvement, Marxism started to make more sense to the Brazilians. And Marx's writings started to become more easily available, so his popularity within the Brazilian Academy would grow as well. The historians I analyzed were Nelson Werneck Sodré, a Brazilian military man, professor, writer, and Marxist historian; Florestan Fernandes, a Brazilian sociologist and politician; and Caio Prado Júnior, Brazilian historian, geographer, writer, philosopher, and politician. Although in politics and in the public opinion, Brazil was a US ally, the Brazilian historians were definitely in the red side of the war. After the end of the war, the scenario changed. There were more works on Marxism in both countries. In the United States, historians would still be conservative on their writings, since the Soviets and consequently socialism would still be viewed as the enemy. The historians I looked for this portion of the paper were Richard Gate Powers, an American historian and professor of history at the College of Staten Island, and Howard Zinn, an American historian, philosopher, socialist intellectual, and World War II veteran. In Brazil, Marxist historians were still very common and did not have the slightest fear of being called communists. Living and feeling the effects of the open veins of Latin America, Marxist ideas would become even more appealing in universities, where people had easier access to and would have enough knowledge to reflect on them. In this section, I analyzed Edgar Canoni's writings, a Brazilian historian, professor, and sociologist, and they were very pro-Marx. Canoni, in one of his works that I looked at, made a timeline of Marx's ideas in Brazil, pointing out that the Brazilian elites would produce the fear of communists in Brazilian people and use that to keep control of society machinery. The Red Scare would be used to establish two dictatorships in Brazil, with more than 2 decades of distance between one another. The second one with the sponsorship of the US during the peak of the Cold War. Canoni agreed with most of Marx's views and believed that they were the best way to find solutions to Brazil's problems. He died in 2003, dreaming of the rise of a Brazilian Marxist revolution. Overall, my discoveries were that Marxism was feared by the public and valued by the academy. Regardless of the views that scholars had, all of them recognized the importance and significance of Marxism, proving that it is indeed a very influential ideology. This recognition shows why studying Marxism is not worshiping the devil, but just an analysis of an important ideology like many others. In a country like the United States, which is supposedly the biggest defender of freedom of speech, it seems unfair to neglect, based on myths, prejudice, and political propaganda, the study of such an important topic. Thank you.